is there's a movement to reassert the yin, because there's this perception that there's too strong or too dominant of a yang that is happening at that time, and maybe still is. We can kind of explore this a little bit. So to really kind of get at where this change is happening, how did this yang become so dominant? How did the control and the male, especially when we're thinking about social systems, become so dominant that the Taoists are wanting to reassert this idea of yin into our perspective? Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and I am so glad you joined us today. Let's begin by reading through the text. The Tao called Tao is not Tao. Names can name no lasting name. So we want to review Tao as it's being used within the Taoist context. Is a little bit different than how it would have been used in everyday language in classical Chinese when the Daodejing originates. So Tao, meaning a way, could be as simple as me telling you the way to get to the grocery store. Now, with something like that, there is the possibility for you to follow that way, but there's also the possibility for you to not follow that way. And the big difference that we have when the Taoists are talking about Tao is they're not talking about a Tao that you have the option to follow. So when it says the Tao called Tao, or more accurately be the Tao that can be Taoed, or the way that can be followed, is not the constant Tao, then what it's saying is that if it's a Tao, if it's a way that can be followed, that's not what we're talking about. And of course, this is what all the competing schools within that, Warring States period with the 100 schools of thought, they were all had a way, a Tao on offer that they were prescribing to the people. And so what they're suggesting is if it's a Tao that you can follow or not follow, this is not the thing that we're suggesting. They elevate it above the level of human interaction to the level of cosmic interaction. Essentially, you might think of Tao in this sense as the way of things, or we might say today like the laws of nature, that I might not even know about or be ignorant of the law of gravity, but there is no way for me not to follow it. I might not want to follow it. I might try to fight against it, but ultimately there's no way for me to do that. The only thing I can do is actually follow it, because that is the way of things. And that's Tao in this Taoist sense, is it's not the one that can be prescribed. It's the one that you have to essentially follow whether you want to or not. So that's the first line. The second line then gets into this idea of names. And sometimes, because of the way that this first line was translated, where it might say something like the Tao that can be spoken of, or something along those lines, is not the constant Tao. It kind of led to this idea that for some reason maybe the Tao is undescribable or unspeakable. And so the second line came to be, if we give it a name, it could never be the ultimate name, because how can you name this thing that's unnameable? But that kind of is weird if then what follows is a whole book trying to do exactly that, describe what the Tao is. Rather, what's happening here is it's introducing another concept that's central to the idea of Taoism. And within that, there's a certain kind of suspicion about names, because names ultimately are a label or a category we put on things to help navigate our world, but they're not actually the thing itself. Things themselves are actually constantly in change. They're coming and going, they're degrading, they're being born, they're dying. It's not constant. And so the idea that something could be a constant name or be the actual thing isn't really a possibility either. And it kind of starts to talk about this concept of absence and presence, which we will get into here a little bit more in the next couple of verses. But what happens is there's kind of this idea that there's this underlying weave of the universe from which everything comes out of and everything returns back. And when it hasn't come out or manifest, it appears as though there's nothing there, when in fact it actually is something. So there's always this kind of different ways or perspectives we can look at this one thing that in some cases is kind of manifest into what we may think of as objects, and other times it seems like there's nothing. And when it's in this kind of object state that we apply names to it, that we want to be careful to recognize that the name is not the thing itself. It is a label we put on it. And the danger of confusing the thing as being a thing itself is that it could become individuated. Names give form, they give definition, and we can get confused to thinking that the thing that we have named is what it actually is. We don't want to do that, because then we start to treat things as individual objects rather than seeing how they're actually connected to everything. Again, in kind of more of a modern context, we might say it's very legitimate to talk about how everything is actually made of atoms. I'm atoms, you're atoms, the camera is atoms. They're just different configurations. So we could say everything is one thing, but it's not very helpful. By placing names or labels like Jim and camera, it helps us to be able to navigate our world. We just need to understand that the names are not the ultimate reality. So continuing then, we get to nameless, the origin of heaven and earth, naming, the mother of 10,000 things. And we spent some time last week talking about how nameless is really using this Chinese character for absence, Wu, and Ming for name. And so we've got this idea of absent name, which could legitimately be translated as nameless, but it can also very accurately be translated as absence names, in this case, the origin of heaven and earth. And in the following line, where it says naming, we've got Yu for this idea of presence, and Ming again for name. So naming, again, an appropriate translation, but it can also be translated as presence names, the mother of 10,000 things. And again, the 10,000 things would be the manifestations that we see, the things that we put names to. A very colorful way of describing essentially the material world that we interact with. So what we have then introduced in these next two lines is this basic overview that I've tried to represent here with these symbols. And I do them where they're layered on top of each other so that we can see that even though I'm using different colors to describe these as different attributes, it's really all just one thing. And so we've got this absence that can also appear as presence, and there's this flow back and forth. But when something becomes present, it's not separate from absence. It's just another way of talking about absence, or another way of perceiving absence. And the whole thing, in terms of how everything works, the way of things, the Tao is kind of this underlying principle about, or pattern for how everything works, but it's not really separate from those things. So it can be a little bit confusing where it sounds like they'll talk about the Tao, or they'll talk about absence, or they'll talk about Qi. It's another concept that comes into play here. And it almost sounds like they're using them interchangeably. And it is because, in a certain sense, they're just talking about different aspects of the same thing. So let's continue then with the second half of the chapter, and this will be the material that we want to cover today. So, empty of desire, perceive the mystery. Filled with desire, perceive manifestations. So here we have a couple of things that are coming into play again. So we've got this idea of empty and filled, which are actually being picked up from these same two words that we had in the previous two lines, Wu for absence and Yu for presence. And here it's saying empty and filled. So it can also be absence and it can be presence. But then desire, we want to be clear here that it's not trying to say that desire is a bad thing. It's not that we're trying to get to a point where we don't have desires. That isn't actually possible, because even if we are desirous to not have desires, we're still desiring to not have desires. So the trick, I think, or the goal within Taoism is to learn how to desire rightly. And that'll kind of get fleshed out as we go through more of the book. But right here, what it's trying to show is that there's two aspects, and it's not that one is better than the other, but we need both to see clearly, to see fully. So there's this empty, this absence place that we could almost say that, desiring absence, we're able to perceive the mystery, or desiring presence, we're able to perceive the manifestations. And both of those are going to be important for the big picture. We don't really want to have just one or the other, but we need both. And I picked up a couple of other translations just so we could look at how they're translated to help kind of flesh out this idea. The first one is from Hinton, David Hinton. In perennial absence, you see mystery, and in perennial presence, you see appearance. And then one from Chad Hansen. Fixing on absence is to want to view enigmas. Fixing on presence is to want to view phenomenon. So that hopefully helps to bring out a little bit of what we were trying to say there. You can see through the different translations, it brings out a little bit more of the nuance that's behind, in the Chinese, that's behind it. So then, let's see how this finishes out, this chapter here. It says, these have the same source. So again, he's talking about this idea of absence and presence, the manifestations and the mysteries, how these are perceived. He's saying, these have the same source, but different names. And here again, we get to this idea of names, right? The names are kind of a label on top, but don't get too confused with that, because it's all still kind of going back to the same thing. Then he concludes by saying, call them both deep, deep and again deep, the gateway to all mystery. Now, the Chinese character that's being translated as deep here is really this word for dark or darkness. And we can see how in the English translation, they're trying to bring out this idea of the profoundness of it. And for us, dark might seem not like a profound thing and possibly a negative thing. So I think that's why they're going with the translation here to call it deep and again deep. But I really like what it's actually saying in the original. They call them both dark. Darkness within darkness, the gateway to all mystery. So there's a very interesting segue here, but besides being mysterious, it's really alerting us to another really key theme for Taoism that's going to get played out throughout the rest of the book that I really want to focus on today. And this is actually one of my more favorite topics to talk about. So darkness then is introducing a concept that is not super explicit in the text, but it's definitely behind the text, and not just with the Daodejing, but much of early Chinese philosophy, and that's the concept of yin and yang. Yin is the dark aspect, and so what we're going to see is a big emphasis on that. So let's kind of break that down a little bit. So we have yin and yang, and this traditional symbol that you've seen, and notice that the way that it's drawn, it's meant to imply that there's a movement from one to the other, that there's a cycle, and that there's a little bit of each other within each side. So it's not a competition thing. It's not a thing of one being better than the other. It's that there's mutual aspects that are both required that have to be taken into consideration or balanced properly for things to be in harmony. And there's a couple of characteristics that they traditionally assign to each of these. And so let's kind of look at that for a moment. And this is not an exhaustive list at all. We're just kind of hitting on a couple of key points that'll help illuminate what's happening in this passage. So on the yang side, the white or bright side is more of this idea of control and also this idea of masculinity. And keep in mind that everybody is going to be a mix of both of these. So this isn't like the male side versus the female side. Both males and females have both the masculine and the feminine aspects within themselves, within their own yin yang. So don't confuse these as being man woman, but they do symbolize more of the characteristic features of those things. So one of the things we can see with the masculine side, with this idea of control, of trying to bring about order, and we can talk about this idea of strength, is then going to be counterbalanced on the yin side with this idea of chaos as opposed to control. But we want to be careful when we're thinking about chaos that it's almost more like novelty or newness, the unexpected things that can emerge. And this is one of the key areas of balance between control and chaos, because if everything is always new and always novel, always somewhat chaotic, that's not good. But if everything is always control, that's not good either. There's always kind of this balance that you need in order for things to actually be in proper harmony. And it's also then associated with the feminine. And we're definitely going to explore a little bit more about why this is going to be important for the Taoist. And it also tends to be focused more on this idea of softness, or one of the key elements or themes that we see within Taoism is water and how it flows, and it doesn't challenge, it goes around, and it finds ways to go beneath instead of trying to be on top. So there's a lot of this male female traits that get played out here, but in particular then what's happening is there's a movement to reassert the yin, because there's this perception that there's too strong or too dominant of a yang that is happening at that time, and maybe still is. We can kind of explore this a little bit. So to really kind of get at where this change is happening, how did this yang become so dominant? How did the control and the male, especially when we're thinking about social systems, become so dominant that the Taoists are wanting to reassert this idea of yin into our perspective? Well, to kind of get a handle on that, we need to look back at one of the most fundamental shifts that happen in human perception. And this is going to have to do with the advent of agriculture. Now, to really kind of get our heads around this, we have to look a little bit at the whole history of humans, or we could say Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens we appeared roughly 300,000 years ago. And it was only about 10,000 years ago that we actually started agriculture. So you can see in this picture here that this graph that 97% of our existence as a species has been lived in more of this hunter-gatherer context. And it was only the last 10,000 years in which we ended up understanding or developing agriculture that comes with a tremendous shift in how we look at things. But notice how new it is in the big scope of things. This is really only makes up 3% of our history. And if we take it even a little bit further and we think about who we are in kind of an industrial, post-industrial context, that's only been in the last 250 years. And this is just a fraction, a small fraction of our total existence. So there's definitely some ways that are very familiar to us, because this is how we grew up and what we were born into, that for the whole scope of human history is rather unique. Gatherers live off of what the natural world just supplies and continually produces. The hunters find that the animals continually reproduce. And so part of what happens then is we start to get this very interesting perspective about the world, and that it is kind of symbolized in this fundamentally generative way of life, a mystery that tends to get represented in these female figurines that were beginning to appear, and we call these Venus figures, and these appeared somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago. And they emphasize the reproductive aspects of female. And it's because this is how they are understanding the world. It is viewed from more of a gift that it kind of continues to give in a mysterious way. This has led to very different social structures that would happen. There would be much smaller tribes at this point then that are part of these hunter-gatherer communities that don't have the same kind of hierarchical structure that we have today. It tended to be much more egalitarian because that was what was needed for how the groups would operate. And there wasn't this idea of possessions. You really couldn't have much of your own things. You just have to be constantly on the move. So when we get then to the shift to agriculture, one of the big consequences that happens is now we're dealing with a fixed piece of property that we're not leaving to go somewhere else. And it's kind of introducing this idea of property, this idea that this is our space and this is where we're growing our food. And consequently, because we can grow this food, we can actually afford to have more people in the same area than we ever could when we were traveling in these small hunter-gatherer bands or tribes. And so within this larger community then, you end up with a whole different set of patterns that are important for survival. And one of them is now you've got to deal with the possibility of invaders. You have to deal with the possibility of protection. And so when you now have to focus on that, there is a shift from the focus on this feminine side of things, this generative nature of well, let me put it this way, this generative aspect of nature. Then we start to see more of a benefit from the male features where it has to do with strength and aggression and this ability to protect. And these same concepts then transform how they build out their mythology, and we see the female deities and figurines being replaced with masculine figurines. Here we see Marduk doing battle against Tiamat, who is one of the symbols in this case of fresh water, but it could also be seen as this idea of nature. There's in Mesopotamia, one of the key concerns that they had was with the flooding that would happen over the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And so here we have Marduk slaying Tiamat, which was then in a sense, kind of the taming of these rivers. And they even have another god that's actually the name for irrigation that had to do with how this got conquered. But the key thing that's happening now is we see this shift to where more of these male attributes become more fundamental to how society is starting to form because of this introduction of a fixed place, this idea of property and needing to protect it. And then ultimately, how do we structure larger and larger groups of people? And so this is going to be, and this is just at a very high level that we're talking about this, but this fundamental shift then that moves from more of an egalitarian view of nature or egalitarian way of being in nature that viewed nature from more of a generative female perspective into more of a larger communities that become much more hierarchical, and it tends to favor more masculine features because it required control, it required protection, security, and you get more of a hierarchy because of the demands of larger populations. A lot more that we could say about both of those aspects, but I just want to, at a very top level, create the very basic distinctions between these two views that we see manifest essentially in every culture moving forward from that shift when agricultural aspects come into play. Now, this pre-agricultural view, this in that beginning of agricultural period kind of begins at the end of the Paleolithic period. So we could say that that prior Paleolithic view of the world tends to still exist in some contexts. We've had some hunter-gatherer tribes that have persisted, although there's very few of them still around, but also we see this sometimes in various indigenous voices, whether we're talking about Native American Indians or when we're talking about the Aborigines. There's a lot that we see coming through in their perspective of the world, how they think about the world, and their place in it. We in Americas tend to recognize that the colonization of America, there was a lot of abuses that happened because the idea of selling the land or property just didn't really make sense to the Indians. They didn't understand what we meant by that. So there's still this persistent view that's trying to hold on to a way of looking at life, the way of looking at the world that persists even today in very minority places. And it's also what's being brought out in this Taoist perspective as well. So I'll just kind of wrap this up by saying that there's kind of these organizing views that are represented between the two sides then that are starting to come to play in the Taoist text of the Daodejing. And when it's talking about this darkness, it's really trying to, again, bring up this theme of reasserting the yin, where in a context in which yang has become far too dominant. And so we can see some organizing views that kind of separate these. So we could start with this basic idea of what is a human? A human in the more post-Paleolithic period ends up seeing humans as separate from nature, that there's somewhat kind of a, we're kind of in nature, but we're not of nature. Whereas from the indigenous perspective or from the Taoist perspective, they would argue that we are actually one aspect of nature. We are fully incorporated within nature, fully a part of nature, not separate from it. And when we think about nature, on the other side, it would be seen as much more of a threat or something that was wild. Whereas on the pre-Paleolithic side, it's seen as much more generative, which leads then to a very different type of tactic or goal for how we operate in the world. Where on the other side, it has to do with this idea of control. How do we civilize? On the Taoist side, it's going to say it's more about how do we harmonize. Again, these are some very broad categories, and they're kind of presented in a black and white fashion, but really everything's kind of on a sliding scale. But it really helps to kind of draw out the nuances in how humans looked at the world prior to agriculture, how they looked at it afterwards, and that there was something to be critiqued about that from the Taoist perspective, and they're trying to reassert some of the perspectives from prior during that Paleolithic view that persisted even through this agricultural revolution in China. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. If you liked this video, please give it the thumbs up, subscribe. If you'd like to get our email where you can have the emails, the videos emailed to you, as well as invitations to our live Zoom presentation of this material on Friday mornings, or in person if you happen to be in the Southern California area on Sunday mornings, that's available through our email, and you can sign up for that at www.kinship.cafe. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Take care.